처음 영상이 시작되면 화면에는 아무런 메뉴가 나오지 않습니다. 이때 영상 화면에 마우스를 대면 아래에 메뉴가 나옵니다. 만약 화면에 마우스 클릭을 하게 되면 영상은 멈추기 때문에 마우스 커서만 대셔야 합니다. 그 다음에 자막 메뉴를 클릭하시면 화면 중앙에 영어로 된 자막이 나타납니다. 이 상태에서 자막을 선택하기 위해 설정을 클릭합니다. 설정을 클릭하면 자막을 선택하는 메뉴가 나옵니다. 여기서 자막을 클릭합니다. 그리고 자동 번역을 클릭합니다. 그러면 다양한 언어가 나오는데 여기서 한국어를 선택합니다. 한국어를 선택하면 화면에서 보듯이 한국어 자막이 시작됩니다.
From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good morning. Welcome to today's program, Create Your Future the Peter Drucker Way, featuring Bruce Rosenstein. I am Gulnar Nagashabayeva, Business Reference Specialist at the Science, Technology, and Business Division of the Library of Congress. It is my great pleasure to introduce Bruce Rosenstein, Managing Editor of Leader to Leader, a publication of the Frances Hesselbein Leadership Institute, formerly the Leader to Leader Institute, and earlier the Peter Drucker Foundation for Nonprofit Management, and Josie Bass. He is the author of Create Your Future the Peter Drucker Way, published in November 2013, and Living in More Than One World, How Peter Drucker's Wisdom Can Inspire and Transform Your Life, published in 2009. He worked for USA Today newspaper for 21 years, until late 2008, as a librarian, and during the final 12 years also as a writer about business and management books for the Money section. Since 1996, he has taught the Special Libraries Information Centers course at the Catholic University of America. In 2012, he was one of two recipients of the 2012 Rose L. Vormelker Award of the Special Libraries Association for dedication to mentoring, outstanding instruction in graduate school settings, and for his own professional achievements. He has studied Drucker's work for more than 25 years. He wrote extensively about Drucker for more than a decade before the publication of his first book. He conducted one of the last interviews with Drucker 7 months before his death in 2005. In 2001, he wrote a series of columns about Drucker for the SLA publication Information Outlook. Besides USA Today and Information Outlook, he has written for several publications, including Leader to Leader, Leadership Excellence, GAMA International Journal, American Executive, and others. Peter Drucker, often called the father of modern management, penned numerous influential works on organization and management. Rosenstein, in his second book based on the late Drucker's wisdom, demonstrates once again that Drucker's teachings go beyond the discipline of management. Today, Bruce Rosenstein will tell us how Drucker's time-tested principles can be applied to shaping not only the future of your organization, but your own personal and professional future. You will have an opportunity to purchase a copy of the book after the program, and can have it signed by the author. Without further ado, I present to you Bruce Rosenstein.
Well, thank you, Gunnar, for that really nice introduction, and it's just great to be here at LC. Thank you to Ellen Terrell, to Jan Hurd, Tom Mann, who I don't think is able to be here today, but Tom started the ball rolling on this quite some time ago. And so I'm really grateful to him and anybody else at LC who I'm not aware of who was involved in doing this. So thanks to you all for coming, both people who work here for LC and people who came from the outside. And it's just a real thrill. You know, you heard about my library background. Even though I'm not a day-to-day librarian anymore, I'm still very much part of the world. So it's a real thrill and a real honor to speak here at LC. Now, I've spoken here before, both solo and as part of panels and that sort of thing, but it was always library related. This is the first time that it's related on as I said, even though library is part of my life now, my world, part of my reinvention as an author within a separate but related world. So this is, as Golnar said, this is my second book on Drucker. The first was published by a really nice independent publisher in San Francisco called Barrett Kohler in 2009. The new book, which came out in November, Create Your Future the Peter Drucker Way, is McGraw-Hill. And the first book was published in 4 countries around the world, and we're hoping that happens not only just those 4 countries, but more for the second book. How many people here, just so I can kind of get the lay of the land, how many people during Drucker's long life saw him speak either in person or on TV or... Okay, so a few of you did. Okay, he definitely had a contact. He had within the library world. He spoke at a Special Library Association annual conference in 2002 in Los Angeles. He was one of the keynote speakers. Monday morning, in those days they had 2 keynote speakers. Monday morning was Peter, and then on Tuesday morning was Doris Kearns Goodwin. And the night before Peter spoke, now he was 92 years old at that point. The night before he spoke, I did an interview with him for USA Today, a sit-down interview with him, 4 hours. And I was just completely drained by the end of this interview. And, we were staying in the same hotel, and we did the interview in the hotel at a restaurant and in his room. And I was just completely drained from spending 4 hours with Peter Drucker. And then thinking about, how am I going to write this story? Fortunately, I didn't have to write it the next day. I wrote it a couple days later, and it went through a variety of changes and came out a little bit after that. And Drucker, at 92 years old, 9:30 in the morning, gave a keynote to 3, 4, 5,000 librarians. And that story, by the way, that article is on my website. There's a lot of free material on my website, including pretty much all the articles I wrote about Peter for USA Today. So as Golnar said, he was considered the father of modern management, but way, way, way beyond that. I mean, way beyond just management. Even though that's true, he was the father of modern management, and he wrote, 39, 40 books, but they weren't all management related books. And the theme of the first book, Living in More Than One World, is that you have a number of different things going on in your life for a variety of different reasons. It's something that he taught, that he preached, and he lived that life. And his books cover a wide range, and I was very pleased that I've been included on the finding aid on your website for Peter's material, along with his own books and other books by him. So Drucker wrote about a really wide variety of subjects, and I don't want to reinvent the wheel. So I don't want to, it's not up to me to really talk yet again about Drucker on management, although I do that somewhat in both of the books. But in the first book, what I did was I put a framework around his work on the individual as opposed to the organization. Again, it was something I was waiting for him to do, and he never did, so I thought, I'm going to do it. And in the second book, it's on his work on the future. There's a voluminous amount of work on the future, but he never did one book, strictly speaking, on the future. So I said, that's what I'm going to do. There actually is a chapter in the first book called Creating Your Future, but I approached it in a much different way in terms of how I did the second book. I'll also say, in terms of these ties with the library world, that my whole interest in this began 28 years ago at Catholic University when I was a student, when I was a library school student. And in my management class, it was a summer course. It was taught by Dwayne Webster, who some of you might know, who Association of Research Libraries for many years was the director. At that point was the associate director. But Dwayne was teaching as an adjunct, as teaching the management class, and he assigned as the textbook the classic Drucker book, 874 pages, or 834 pages, Management Tasks, Responsibilities, Practices. Now, as a summer course, we didn't have to read the whole book, but we had to read a fair amount of it, and I was just entranced. I knew who Drucker was. I'd heard about him, but I'd never read him before. And it spoke to me on a really deep level. And I should say there is nothing in that book about libraries, nothing whatsoever. But I had discovered that even then he had spoken to various library groups, and I found some articles about it. I found a speech transcript, and this just really got me going throughout my library career, and it got me going on the whole idea of learning more about management, learning more about Drucker, and that became my specialty. And as Gunnar said, after I was at USA Today for a certain amount of years, I already had a lot of writing experience. I had no library experience when I started library school or at USA Today, zero, none. But I had a lot of writing experience. And then I just moved that into the realm of writing about management books, business books, and especially Drucker books. And first it was just writing about him, about books about him, and then I had the opportunity to do interviews with him by fax, which is kind of funny when you think about it now. Part of that was his hearing, which wasn't too great. Keep in mind, he was at that stage, he was quite advanced in years, yet he was still putting out books, he was still speaking. If any of us are fortunate enough to be around at 92 and asked to be the keynote speaker at an SLA or similar conference, I think we'd be doing pretty well. So there was that tie there in terms of that everything came together in 2002. He was scheduled to be the speaker at SLA in Los Angeles. I was already writing about him, and I already had some contact with him. And I said to my editor, if I'm going to be out there, and he had a new book coming out at that point too. It was a collection, but it was a new book. And I said, I'd like to do a feature story on him rather than just kind of book reviews. And he said, well, if you can get him talking about the corporate scandals, then and if it's good enough, we'll do a feature story. And again, so this was another thing where the gods came together for me, because the corporate scandals were going on then. It was Enron and that sort of thing. And so, we asked him for an interview, and as I said, we were staying at the same hotel, and he said, we'll meet for drinks at 6:30 and see what happens. He had I'm not going to try to imitate his accent, but he had this deep, he was from Austria, and his deep accent, and spoke in a very low voice. And he said, we'll meet for drinks at the bar. And we did, and USA Today sent their top photographer from Los Angeles with me. So I think he sort of Drucker saw instantly that things were like a little bit different, that he wasn't just kind of meeting me, that we had the photographer there. So we just went up to his hotel room, and then the photographer did his thing and left. And then we went to the restaurant. We went to a Japanese restaurant. There's a big, I'll tell you a little bit more later, big connection between Drucker and Japan, and there was a Japanese restaurant in the hotel. So again, this led to 4 hours, and again, this is on the website, but he told me about the corporate scandals, and what I'll basically say is he said he wasn't surprised that these things go through cycles. He lived so many years that he saw these things happening in waves. One thing I remember that he said was that it's always the brilliant ones who get caught, which I thought was quite interesting. So that really emboldened me to write a book. I had not written a book at that point, and I called him up and said I wanted to come out to California to talk to him. And I wasn't asking for his permission, but I was just saying I want to do this, and I'd like to be able to talk to you. And of course, it'd be a whole lot better to do the book if he'd talk to me and not just rely on other sources. And he did. So I went out there several times to talk to him. One of those talks, the one was 7 months to the day before he died in 2005. We did a video. It's professionally shot and edited. There's a trailer for it on my website, but sometimes when I do presentations, I do the full. It's 20 minutes of me interviewing Peter. We're both on screen, and the video on my website is just title cards and Peter. And again, that is not about libraries or it is somewhat about information, but it's about things that are applicable to all of us here today who are either librarians are somewhere involved in that world or in the information world or whatever world you're in. My guess is that you are what Drucker called a knowledge worker. He was the one to come up with that term in the 50s. And so in this whole idea of the future, it just really fascinated me about he had written so much but just didn't do that one book that tied it all together. And I felt that really needed to be done. So in the second book, there are some direct, there's some interview material that I did with Peter that was not used in the first book, but I took things from various books that I felt were relevant, of Drucker's books, included those. I also reached out to other thought leaders, people, whether they were involved in the Drucker world or not. Some of them were people that I had come to know through being the managing editor of Leader to Leader. There were people who wrote articles for us. So just people I've gotten to know over the past however many years. And I included all that material. And I also have breakout boxes with quotes from Drucker's books. And I think that, you know, especially for those of you who are librarians, I think you will enjoy that part of it. And also the fact that there's if I must say so myself, a really good resources section at the back of the book of books, websites, journal articles, what have you. So, but pulling all this together was not easy. I came upon what I felt were 10 elements. He did not say, you know, these are the 10 elements of the future. He did not say that. But I'm saying that based on his work. And the first part of that is that the future is a mindset. It's how you think about it. It's being forward thinking. It's being future oriented. It's factoring tomorrow into your decisions today. And you see this over and over in Drucker's work. So that's the first part of it. The second part of it is that the future must be created. That you can't just leave it to chance. You can't leave it to fate. You can't say, well, we don't know what's going to happen in the future, so therefore, you know, who cares? And I'm just going to kind of keep my head down. And he basically said that was not good enough. It was not good enough for individuals. It was not good enough for organizations. And I'd like for you to think as you listen today and then beyond this, and perhaps if you're reading the book, to think about this on several levels, to think about it for you personally, professionally, for the whole profession, whatever your profession is in. And if I could be so bold as the Library of Congress as an institution. I mean, every institution now has to really, and I'm not saying you're not because I haven't checked into it, I'm sure you are, thinking of the future. But the information world, as we all know, is moving so rapidly, changing so rapidly, that I would, you know, challenge you to think about where all this applies to the future of where you work. And I know that I'm really onto something about the future because another challenge I'll give you is see how long it takes today, maybe on your way home tonight, commuting, to come upon an ad, TV, web, radio, newspaper, magazine, that's future themed. It's not going to take you very long. I'm very attuned to these things now, so I see them all the time. Intel, sponsors of tomorrow, very often financial, very big, expensive, full-page ads in, you know, The Economist or somewhere like that. Financial institutions. I think part of that is the future is scary. There's no doubt about it. It's anxiety-producing, and I think these organizations are saying, they're acknowledging that it, and they're also saying, subtly or not, you know, we can help you with this. So I know that I'm onto something. If these big corporations are spending millions and millions of dollars on advertising and marketing about future-oriented themes, I think that I'm onto something with what I'm doing. Because what I'm doing is not about predictions. It's about how do you take this material and it's an approach, and it's as all contained as I could make it within the book. So just keeping that it's, I do treat the theme in the book about people who do make predictions on the future. Drucker, at least in his writing, was a little bit down on this, although some of the things that he did, if you look at them, if you read them on the page, they read like predictions. But he didn't call them that. In one book he said he called what he wrote conclusions. So is that the same thing? I don't really know. But I do list some of the other futurists. I think that some of the futurists that are out there now are really writing some really interesting material, and you have to just you have to kind of take it in, and a lot of it is based really on what's going on now. Some of it's science and technology based, some of it's not. So I mentioned some of those in the book. Here in the Washington area, we have the World Future Society, which I became a member of in the past year or two. It's based right here in Bethesda, and I mentioned them in the book and some of the work they do. There's also something in California called the Institute for the Future. I mentioned a book by one of their executives named Bob Johansen, which was published by Barracola, the company that did my first book. So I think there's a lot of good work in that area, but it's somewhat separate from what I'm doing, even though I've mentioned it and referenced it in the book. So I mentioned some other elements, but I don't really want to go into those right now. They're in the book. Another thing, though, I want to say is that he came up with this idea late 50s, early 60s. It was a great phrase called the future that has already happened. And I mean, he used this in a number of different contexts for years and years and years. First time I saw it was in something that I think it might have been a speech in the very late 50s, but it was in a fantastic book that's very future-oriented that I would recommend to you from 1964 called Managing for Results. And then in 1997, when the Harvard Business Review had their 75th anniversary, I mean, think about this. Wouldn't you like to be, Harvard Business Review has their 75th anniversary. Wouldn't you like to be the person they come to say, would you please write a special essay for our 75th anniversary issue? There were 4 or 5 people that they asked. I name all of them in the book, and one of them was Peter. And he wrote an essay called The Future That Has Already Happened. But the idea is, well, how do you really discover this? If these are things that have, in essence, they're history, but they're things maybe where the ripple effects have not yet been totally seen. So now Drucker didn't really sketch these things out a lot. Well, you do X, Y, Z. However, what I came up with was, one is through human intelligence. Things like meeting in groups, like orienting book groups. Many of us are part of a book group, and then you meet about within a group of people in a book group that maybe has a future theme on books that might detail what the future that has already happened. Another is journal clubs. I did not know anything about journal clubs until 2010, when Catholic University, the Mullen Library, the main library, invited me to speak there to be the speaker for their journal club. And they said, instead of a journal article this time, we're going to do your book. And I have to admit, I didn't know what it was, but I got fascinated in the idea, and I saw it was a big deal in the world of science and medicine. So I think this is something where we could easily do future-themed articles or whatever within journal clubs. As a matter of fact, last Thursday, right here in D.C., I was the guest speaker and the moderator for the journal club for an organization called AWAN, Association of Women's Health and Obstetric Nurses. And that was really a fascinating experience to be in on their group. So those are ways. I mean, another way is something that's obviously very key to what you all do here in this building, and that's what's available online. That most people now, when you think about it, people in the outside world have access to things, both obviously at LC, but through their public libraries as well, have access to online material that would have been unthinkable not all that long ago. So a lot of people, I think, do not realize that, let's say in the case of public libraries, that they have this kind of access just through their library cards. I think maybe that public libraries need to do a better selling job about that. But there's so much fantastic information out there that before was considered totally proprietary, as you know, or very expensive, and that now people can access. And for those people who are lucky enough to work at an organization such as that might have a special library or an academic library, that have even deeper access to, let's say, scientific journal articles, business articles, all the better. So, but thinking of it and thinking of the implications of what does this mean to me personally, professionally, what does it mean to my organization where I work, and what does it mean maybe to profession. By the way, Drucker was, he would often advocate even going beyond that to two short anecdotes to say about that. I interviewed a number of for both books. I interviewed his students, and one of his students told me that she said that Drucker told them that when they were making decisions, business decisions, one of the things they should factor in, not just, is it good for me, is it good for my organization, is it good for my family, whatever, is it good for mankind? Just like, how many people say that? And also I relate an anecdote in the book. In 1964, when Managing for Results came out, he was the commencement speaker at the University of Scranton, Pennsylvania, where I grew up. At that time, I would have been a young boy and oblivious to who Peter Drucker was, that maybe like he was 1 mile from my house giving a commencement address. But I found newspaper articles about it that were fascinating, absolutely fascinating, about what he told these graduates. And that's one of the things, and by the way, these people now are of retirement age, which is pretty interesting. But he told them that they really had to think about mankind, and they had to think about the money that had been invested in them by their parents, by their community, and by their society. He was could be a real tough love sort of guy as far as giving advice to people and to corporations. There's a line from one of his lesser known books that I quote in the book in my chapter about organizations. There's a line saying that, I don't have the exact quote right in my head, but he basically said that even the seemingly most successful corporation of today is a sham and a failure, and that is exact wordage, if they are not actively building their own new and different tomorrow. I mean, that's pretty interesting, and you see this played out. He wrote that in 1996, and of course you saw what happened in the years after 1996. And a lot of organizations that thought they were really big and powerful, had met their comeuppance. So he could be very, very direct with the people that he was consulting with in his writing and what have you. I should say, though, that I always found him to be very warm. He had a great sense of humor, and I treasure those times that I interviewed him. I treasure that video that I did. No one can take away those experiences from me. No matter what happens with my books, no matter what happens with my speaking, with my career, no one can take away the fact that I had that kind of access with this just towering figure. As some of you may know, he was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2002. When I interviewed him in the restaurant, it was June of 2002, and he knew that I lived in Washington, and he said, I'm going to be there soon, but I'm sworn to secrecy. I can't tell you why. And of course, that really, why is he coming? Because I also knew that at that point he really, his health wasn't the greatest, and he wasn't doing a lot of traveling. I figured this has got to be important, because I should say he lived in California also. He lived not far from Los Angeles, so in Claremont. So I figured this is pretty big. And again, this is the God smiling on me sort of thing. In between the time we did the interview, then it was announced that he was getting the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and it was yet another great thing to be able to put into that USA Today article. So again, I found him to be very warm. He answered his own telephone. He had no clerical people. He was a real one-man band. So he would answer his own telephone. When we set up interviews, he did all that on his own. So it was quite interesting. So the other thing then becomes how do you get that way? I mean, I think a lot of us would like to just get just a little bit of this kind of huge level of achievement that Drucker had. And we're talking about on 3 parts: on consulting, lots of for-profit consulting with companies like Procter & Gamble, various car companies, healthcare organizations, but also lots and lots of pro bono consulting as well. Teaching, he taught at a school named after him, the Drucker School at Claremont, before that at NYU and a couple of other places. And then the writing. Not only the 39 books or 40 books, depending on how you count, millions and millions of sales all over the world, but many, many articles. He wrote a column for the Wall Street Journal for 20 years. He wrote a number of articles for the Harvard Business Review. He wrote for Forbes, Fortune, The Atlantic. He even wrote for things like Saturday Evening Post. So I thought, well, how do you get to that point? I came up with this concept, which, in the interest of time, I won't go into it now, but it's explained in detail in the book, in the third chapter of the book, called Becoming Your Own Successor. And I thought, well, what were the real things that kept Drucker going and kept him so much in the public eye and so popular and being so achievement-oriented, when a lot of people just would have maybe just retired. Most of his books, by the way, came out, majority of the books came out after what would be retirement age, after 65. I mean, he just sailed way, way beyond that. And I marked the part in the book here because I want to make sure I get this right. So what were these things? And I had to really go through the material and see what was it, I think, that separated him out. The first is kind of what I alluded to just a moment ago, that you diversify your efforts and outputs. And, again, he wrote these books and articles on a regular basis. What people maybe didn't see in one way, they would see in another. As I mentioned with the consulting, the for-profit companies, lots and lots of nonprofits. I would recommend to you a great book that came out in 2013 by Rick Wartzman, who's the executive director of the Drucker Institute in California, which is next door to the Drucker School. And it's called Drucker: A Life in Pictures. And what they did is the Drucker Archives, which I'm sure everybody in this room would really appreciate, the Drucker Archives, even if you're fortunate enough to go there, or even if you're not, they've digitized tremendous amounts of material on their website, and I would recommend that you go there. But what they did is they got a really good Los Angeles photographer, and I'm blanking on her name right now, but they got her to photograph lots of things that were in the archives, and then Rick wrote text around them. And one of the things was these sheets of paper that showed his pro bono consulting. And it was just, I mentioned some of it in my book. It was just a wide variety of people. So he would meet, I think one of the reasons he knew about the future was because he was hearing about it from all these different sorts of people. He was hearing about it from the for-profit end. On the nonprofit end, he was hearing about it from universities, from museums. He also did labor unions, by the way. A lot of people think, he was just doing big business. That's not true. One of the things that you'll see if you get a look at Rick's book is you'll see a couple notes back and forth with Cesar Chavez. Think about that. So it was not just like all the Procter and Gamble's of the world. It was Cesar Chavez and museums and universities as well. So, and again, wouldn't we want to be in this position where people like that wanted to come to us for help, whether it was pro bono or paid or not? Second point is, I don't think he would really like this terminology, but it's true, developing a powerful personal brand. I just, this is a concept that's been out for quite some time now, but it's true. I think all of us, rightly or wrongly in terms of the term, but it's true. We've got a brand, and hopefully our brand is based around things like integrity and quality, and that's certainly what Drucker stood for. You looked at the name Drucker and you kind of knew what you were getting, and I think we all need that for ourselves. The third point was maintaining a global outlook and worldview. Drucker was born in Austria. He went to college and grad school in Germany. He worked in London for a while, then came to the United States in 1937. He used to do, so he would teach during the year at Claremont, and then he would do In the summertime, he would do Asian and European lecture tours. So he certainly had this global outlook. And one of the reasons I put it in the book was when I interviewed him on that time in a video in 2005, and I said, well, you had the classic book, Effective Executive, in 1967. If you could update it now in terms of things like the changes in telecommunications, what would you put in there? And he said to me that things like changes in telecommunications were certainly important, but what was more important was maintaining a global worldview and outlook. And that, it's a wide world out there. And you think about it now, the things that we can do are accessible to people anywhere in the world. We can work for people anywhere in the world. The world has shrunk a lot since, let's say, 1967. So I think that's important for us to keep in mind. The next is remaining relevant. What is it that you can do to remain relevant over a long period of time? And again, here was Drucker at 92 being the keynote speaker for SLA. I mean, they theoretically could have had anybody, and they asked him. So, I mean, I think that's up to you in terms of what you're going to do to remain relevant. Certainly within the library and information worlds, remaining relevant becomes harder and harder all the time through technology and other things. It just does. So again, it's something to think about and talk about a little bit more in the book. And something I think is really important is producing this consistently impressive body of work. That I think for a lot of us, it's going to be a portfolio of projects that we can point to rather than saying, I had this job, that job. A lot of times job titles are meaningless. What does librarian mean right now? It can mean a million different things. But you can point to things that you've done. Drucker obviously could with his books and articles. And now, think about it, they're so much more accessible than they were before. Books that were harder to get, that he maybe published years and years ago, are now easy to get. They're digital. Articles before that, you would basically maybe have to come to the Library of Congress to get. Well, a lot of those things are now available. And that might not be available for free, but they're available. And obviously that's not just him, that's lots of other people. So this body of work, that whether it's on our website, whether it's things that we can point to that we did, but that it's hopefully that it's impressive and that it's done over a body of time and that it's cumulative. I think that's really important, that what you do is cumulative. And then the last point is that creating work that benefits others. And that was really, I think, what a lot of his work was predicated on, is really helping people. He did a lot of, mostly I would say, informal mentoring of people. Sometimes there were people who he had business relationships with, and sometimes it was other people. And he really developed these friendships, but also really these mentoring relationships, whether or not he would use that word. Has anybody ever read any of the books or know about Bob Buford, B-U-F-O-R-D? Bob is a really fascinating person. I wrote about him a little bit in the first book and mentioned him in the second book. And Bob was one of those people who had both a business relationship and a friendship, mentoring relationship with Peter. And Peter hardly ever wrote forewords to people's books. They were asking him all the time, but he didn't do it. But he wrote the forewords for 2 of Bob's books. And Bob was somebody who was very successful in cable television and then eventually moved from that world into the world of nonprofit, also into the world of spirituality and religion, which I talk about in this book as well. But Bob wrote 4, fantastic books, and he has a new one coming out called Drucker and Me that I believe is really going to go into this issue of the personal relationship, besides what he learns from him in a business sense. So I'd recommend any of his books to you. But again, this whole idea of, how do you help people with what you're doing? In the first book, if I must say so myself, he gave me some great quotes during the interview. And in the first book, I asked him about people who were just pretty much money-oriented. And he said that the people who are if you're money-oriented, you're probably going to make money, but a lot of those people were miserable. Yes, you need to make money. There's nothing wrong with doing that. But he said people who are achievement-oriented, he said, if you make money at a certain point, well, what's left? He said, but he said things like if you had a company that's working, a hospital that's working. Those were his actual words. He said, that's something you can point to that you're never finished with. I mean, you can point to those achievements, but you never run out of things to do. You never run out of good, good work to do. So I think he predicated so much of this idea on helping others. And with the consulting relationships, he would, he could really pick and choose. And as he got older and his traveling got harder for him, he really reduced the amount of clients quite a bit. And they would have to, they would go out to California and spend time with him. Another thing he would do, by the way, that I thought was very cool, was that when he would want to know about a subject, a couple things he did. He did 3-year study. He would pick a subject and then just study it for 3 years. And this is really pretty much before the online era now. It's pretty easy to do that now. For him, it would have involved a little bit more work. But one of the things he did, which I thought was fantastic, was that, say you're the expert on a particular subject, he would call you up, whether he knew you personally or not, and said, would you come out to California and spend a day with me and talk with me about this? And hey, I would do that if I were called. I'm sure most of us would do that as well. So maybe we can't really call the top expert on a particular subject to come and meet with us, but we have so many ways of doing these types of things that made Drucker so important to the world. I just want to say a few more things, and then I want to go into Q&A, and then hopefully sign some books outside. The last point was this whole idea of building your future beyond the workplace. As I mentioned about, with organizations, he had that kind of tough love approach, and I go into that much more detail in the book. In terms of both organizations and individuals, what he recommended was combining two things: a systematic abandonment, which is if you weren't already doing something now, would you do it? And that was one of his tenets. The other was Kaizen, which is, some of you know, or maybe a lot of you know, it's a Japanese term, but my understanding it's an American process of slow incremental improvement, day by day by day. In my book, I called it remove and improve. So you remove the things that no longer work and you improve what's there. And he said that would then lead to genuine innovation. And the last point in this idea of something else where I've marked the point in the book because I want to make sure I get it correct. This idea of how do we develop as adults, both within the workplace and outside of it. And one of the people who wrote an article for me for Leader to Leader, her name is Jennifer Garvey-Berger. She's a leadership consultant in New Zealand. So I asked her about this and about this future-oriented part of her work on adult development. And just real quick, I'll read this and end on this. In my own work, she said, the adult development ideas help us think about how much of the future different people can grasp and how abstract their sense of the possibilities might be. We all know that earlier in our lives we are more present-oriented and we think rather narrowly about the impact of events, often just those things that affect us or those to whom we are particularly close. A rich and nuanced view of the future, as well as the sense that we can work to create or author our own future rather than having more of an audience relationship to the future, comes later in our developmental journey. I think those are really powerful words. So again, what I try to do is bring in Peter, bring in these thought leaders, bring in my research, and this whole idea of how we can create the future. So I would love to take some questions now. Yes.
Whether you choose to answer based upon your interviews with Peter Drucker or his books or your own experience, whichever is most appropriate would be great. But what about those libraries that are currently experiencing severe funding cuts such that they have to cut their staff, their hours, their collections monies, and so severe that many of them actually have to close? There's a lot of libraries who are having to close. What would you tell those people who are currently facing those types of issues, or at least maybe they'll have to close within 5 years? what would you tell them that they should try to learn from, especially those library staffs that do not have a business background or feel like they don't have the time to go and read all those books?
Okay, thank you for the question. And I've been asked to kind of restate the question. So the question is, for libraries who are under severe budgetary restraints and who are either maybe even about to be closed or under threat of being closed, what can be done? How should those people, especially people who are not maybe business oriented or who don't read these sorts of books, how should they think about and deal with the future? And it's a wrenching question, and I think it goes over a number of different libraries. I think we're talking public. I don't know a whole lot about the academic world, but I'm sure the academic world has their challenges. But certainly the public library world is being threatened to some extent. And the special library world, the world that I came from, hugely threatened. I have personal, after 21 years at USA Today, I was laid off. There is no library anymore at USA Today. Now, I love USA Today. I still read it. I still have friends there. But very many of these media organizations just felt that they no longer needed libraries. So I think you need to approach it a number of different ways. If there is a way if the library is really threatening extinction, I think you need to think about, and again, every library is different. It would depend what type of library it is. But I would think, you really need to think about what the mission, what the purpose. Drucker was very big on the whole idea of purpose. What is it you're trying to do? Are you doing it well, really in an objective sense? Are you doing it well? And if that library is worth saving, and it may be worth saving in some part, maybe not all the individuals within that library are going to make it, maybe not all the parts of the collection, if there is one, are going to make it. But I think that certainly one of the things that they need to do is to step back, maybe separate from the workday, and individually or in groups. Maybe it's a good idea to do this combination of systematic abandonment and Kaizen. Maybe there's things that they're doing that they've just been doing for a long period of time and they don't need to do anymore, and then improve what's there. Certainly working on their relations with whoever the funders are. And hopefully it's not too late to do that. In some cases, maybe it's just going to be too late to do that. Hopefully all along, you're not only doing your work well, but you're keeping up your relations with the people who matter, and you're doing your marketing well enough, and your brand. But I think you raise a good point that the individual is part of this too, and those individuals have to decide. Let's say that library is going to close in 5 years. Well, I think they need to decide what's going to happen for them within those interim 5 years, and is this something that's worth being part of for those 5 years or not? And in the book, I talk a lot about what kind of ongoing learning can people get, whether it's through community college, through MOOCs, through going back for a degree, whatever it might be. And so I think people need to look in a very clear-eyed way about these things, both as you personally, not you, but individuals personally, professionals, and within their libraries. But these are great wrenching questions that are playing out over and over. And then I think it also means what's going on in the overall organization. Not that you don't see the library as an island, that you see the library as part of the organization, whether or not it's a special library, and then considering that within there. So again, whole books, conferences can be part of that. But thank you for your question. Other questions? Yes.
Does your book come with the audio version?
Yes, thank you. And I did not plant that question, but there is, the first book did not have an audio component. This book does. A company called Brilliance Audio, which is owned by Amazon. It's an MP3 and a six CD spoken word. So thank you very much for reminding me about that. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I'm wondering, since you have a body of work, so to speak, focusing on management and Drucker in particular, I'm wondering if was there anything in particular over time that was a surprise to you as you got to know Drucker, and also as you saw how others, people like your colleagues and the like, might have reacted to his insights and the like? So basically, what surprised you during this journey?
Thanks for the question. The question is, what surprised me during the journey of interviewing Peter and getting to know him and writing about him? And I think that one thing is that at the beginning I did not know that I had to make that mental shift from reading about him for years and years and thinking about him as sort of an untouchable sort of figure, to actually having to engage, to call him up about the book, to call him up about arranging the interview. And I think that one thing was that, once, he liked what I wrote about him. If I was just coming as a total stranger, maybe it'd be a different thing. But he'd already seen the things I wrote about him. So I was kind of in the system, as it were. But seeing how, within that, how approachable and personable, he could be. And besides the whole idea of, answering the phones and all of that, when we did the video, and I'd never done a video before, and this was at the Drucker Archives building that I mentioned to you, but this was in 2005 when it had a different configuration than it does now. And so we're sitting there and we're kind of getting set up for the video. And again, I'd never done them. Peter had done lots and lots of videos over the years, many, many videos. So he said to me, as they were putting the mics on us and everything, he said, well, what should we call each other? And I certainly had not thought about that. And I said, well, how about if I call you Dr. Drucker? He said, no. And I said, well, how about if I call you Professor Drucker? He said, no, I hate that. So I thought, okay. And then there was just like a beat. And he said, well, how about just Peter and Bruce? And I said, it's okay with me if it's okay with you. And, it was just like, what a cool thing for him to say. And that really put me at ease. And, within that, when we did that video, he, as I said, his hearing wasn't really all that great. So I had given him questions ahead of time. But during the interview, he was, maybe it's because we were sitting close enough to each other, the follow-ups, which he didn't know anything about, he could hear perfectly. And so he was thinking about some of these original questions, but there were a number of follow-ups as well. So he was able to handle those perfectly, totally off the cuff. And I think that was something that, again, to me was very, very impressive, that he was able to do that. So I think that approachability, that warmth, I think Bob Buford's book will bring that out. I try to bring a little bit of that out in the book, but I tried not to make it too personal. There are some personal things, especially in the second book. And my publicist, Patty Danos, when she read the book, said that she could tell it was written with both my head and my heart, which I thought was really great. So thank you for your question. Do we have maybe one or two other questions? I can go on all day doing this, but I know that you have to get back to work, and but I can go on all day talking about these things. Do we have one or two questions? Remember, I teach. I will call on people if we're not.
I have another question.
Sure.
I'm familiar with Kaizen because of Deming and
Right.
PQM and all of that sort of thing from my MBA in project management. But I had the sense from some of the reading I've done of Drucker that he had an interest in Japanese culture and Japanese art in particular. Were you able to get a sense of, whether that was a passing thing or how that came about?
Well, thank you. And yes, it was a big part of his life. And I wrote about it in both books. It was definitely not a passing thing. It was something that went from the 1930s, was when he first got interested in Japanese art, until, basically the day he died. He built up a big collection, and so the Drucker School, when they had the 100th anniversary, would have been the 100th anniversary of his birth in 2009, and I was out there both for that, and then the book ended part of that in 2010. So they showed this collection of art. It was fantastic at the Scripps College, which is part of the Drucker, Claremont schools, at their art gallery. was called Zen, Zen with an exclamation point. Fantastic thing. I mentioned in the books that for a couple of years he taught Japanese art at Pomona College, which is also part of the Claremont schools. There's a great book that I reference in my book called The Ecological Vision, and he wrote, there's a whole section in there about Japan, not just Japanese art, but one of the chapters is about Japanese art. It's absolutely fascinating. So Drucker was huge in Japan. He would go there like pretty much every year. My first book came out in the Japanese language. I was really privileged to speak there. There's this entity called the Drucker Workshop. I was one of the main speakers for their annual meeting in Tokyo in May of 2012, an incredible experience. I stay in touch with a lot of people from Japan. So it was really very, very ongoing, and the level of interest in Drucker in Japan is so huge. I mentioned in the second book, the biggest selling book, and this is true, it's either 2009 or 2010 in Japan, biggest selling book is a novel about, it's kind of a graphic novel of, and it's, the loose translation is, what if a female manager of a high school baseball team read Drucker's Management? This sold like honest to God, it sold like 2 million copies. I met the author, who's now on the Drucker Institute Board of Advisors. I met him and spoke to him after my talk. And I have I don't understand it. I have a copy of the book. They gave me a copy of the book. I mean, this was huge. So when you think about that, and apparently it brought up, I mean, it was a story of how this young woman in managing her high school baseball team used Drucker's principle and turned a team. My understanding was they were sort of a high academic but low athletic school. But she said, well, we should be both the high academics and high athletics. So using Drucker, she had them win the championship or whatever. So and this Drucker Workshop. I mean, there's all these CEOs there. I mean, it was quite amazing. I mean, they had to pry me out of there. They had to pry me out of that. I didn't want to leave that building that day. So it's really, really huge in Japan. So thank you for that question. So thank you again for having me. Thank you very much. Please stay in touch and enjoy the rest of your business day.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.